Hi, I'm John Stevens,
This is Matt Russell.
and this is Pod Have Mercy.
This is Pod Have Mercy.
We start our podcast this week with our masks on because even though I'm taking it off. We are socially distanced, physically distanced in these things. It may look like we're close, but we're like more than 6 feet apart. I'm really excited about not only this week, but next week, the episode that we're doing, really the interview that we're going to do with Marc Boom, has a lot of great information in it, and we have turned this into 2 episodes. So this week, we're going to be visiting with Marc. Matt and I are going to be doing that, and we're joined by Joseph Clam, who still has his mask on, who's our executive pastor, but Joseph's also on the Board of Trustees, the school board here for Spring Branch Independent School District. And so while the first episode today will be about the virus and what's going on and updating us on all the relevant information, the second part, which will be next week, will be about schools reopening, regathering in worship. And so I invited Joseph to be a part of that conversation since he's really involved in all of that. So I'm really excited that you're going to get to hear Marc and all of us just share some information about all that's going on. Yeah, I think that would be a good place for us to start right now is, when we talked to you last, it was very early. I think last time we did this was very early in all of this. And so we've been through, a lot since then. And so why don't you just kind of give everybody sort of an overview of where we are in Houston, where we are with all of this as far as the numbers, and we'll just kind of ask them some questions as we go along here about that.
Sure. Well, we're thankfully in a much better place than we've been, but we've got a long way to go. So I don't want anybody to feel like we're out of the woods because we're not even remotely so. But from a community basis, what we all saw was we got through May pretty well. And then it really started getting out of control post Memorial Day and into June. And the second half of June, things just exploded. So put that in perspective at somewhere like Houston Methodist, 2,300 beds across 7 hospitals plus a long-term acute care hospital, which we've also been using some specific for COVID. So 8 locations around the city. We had 207 known positives, probably 250 at peak. During that first wave with some people being worked up and that kind of thing. So we were using about 250 of our 2,300 beds. This second time around, we got up to using 750 plus. So, very dramatic rise. And in between, we had gotten down to about 85 to 100. So we went up by more than 7, almost, pushing 8-fold actually, that second time around. And that was very, very challenging, and really, frankly, didn't change in the community until the masking order happened. There's no question in my mind that the masking order and honestly some behaviors that go along with that, because I think it sends a strong message, got things starting to be under control. But we spent most of July, from a hospital perspective, sort of treading water at that 700 to 750 range. So really tough on our staff. Very dramatic, use of hospital beds, unit after unit after unit across the system getting converted just for patients with COVID. But thankfully, a couple of weeks ago, turned the corner and, have come down now into about the 470, 480 range. So, we're down 25% or so from peak. Which is a very good thing, actually a little more than 25, but somewhere in that range. That's obviously a very, very good thing. Yeah. But we've got a long, long way to go. And the thing that concerns us is the testing data in the community leveled off long before the hospitals did, as we would have expected to, since the hospitalizations lag. But it's just stubbornly not coming down. In fact, it may even be creeping back up right now. And the R factor, which is the spreadability factor, which anytime it's over 1 is bad, anytime below 1 is good, has crept back up over 1. So we're watching that with caution. Our models suggest from a hospital perspective, we can continue to come down for some time. But the reality is, as a community, we need to figure out how we get the virus in control so that we are able to do a lot of the things that I know we'll talk about today, like opening up schools, like, expanding worship services and those kinds of things. And unfortunately, we're at about as high a virus level in the community as we have been at any given time from a testing positivity standpoint.
Wow.
That's fascinating because we talked about this before you and I either text or on phone is that, people are just done with it. They're just ready to be done with it.
I know they're feeling, trust me.
They're just done with it. And so, but it's like a mental thing. It's like mentally I'm done with it. That doesn't mean it's over. And one of the things that I have found with the people that I talk to, and I know Joseph has with, the school board meetings and Matt and all of us, is what are the numbers that really matter that we look for? Because I know on the tmc.edu, which we send people to, you've got a lot of dashboards. Some of that has changed. But like for example, I'll get an email from someone, they'll say, why can't we have church? The deaths are very, very low. Very few people die. So I try to explain other numbers to look at. When you think about what are the numbers that you would say people are listening to, because sometimes the media or the news will say, hey, it doesn't make you sick. Most people are asymptomatic. A lot of people don't die. And yet then we hear from other sources that, man, we're still, like you say, at a very high level. What are the things people should pay attention to?
Sure. Well, if I may, let me back up a step because you had a bunch of things in there. But let me talk just in general about kind of the data and, the voices that are out there. Because, one of the very unfortunate things about this virus has been the lack of unity that we've seen in our country. And frankly, voices on really either end of the spectrum, oftentimes, frankly, trying to use the same data to make wildly different, 180-degree different points. And as in most things in life, when you get out to either extreme, neither extreme is probably right. And usually the right answer is somewhere in between. That has been, to be quite honest, a frustrating challenge. So let me put it in perspective a little bit. So in 2017 and 18, we had a flu season that was, worse than we'd seen in a few years. It was about double the volume of patients admitted. So over an 8-month flu season, we admitted about 2,000 patients at Houston Methodist. Of those patients, only about 2% of them needed an ICU bed over the course of 8 months. Now, the bulk of that flu season was 4 or 5 months. The peak number of beds we ever used was 192, but again, very few ICU beds, which are the tough beds to staff because, 1-to-1 nursing versus 1-to-4 nursing and things like that. And we had a mortality rate of about, over the last 3 flu seasons even, of about 2.2% once you're hospitalized. So much lower than that, obviously, broadly in the community. But if you're sick enough to get hospitalized, about 1 in 50 people or so will die from the flu. With this illness, we're now at just under 5,000 people who have been admitted, in about a 5-month period. But the reality is about 3,500 of those have been admitted in, about a 7-week period here. And so wildly more explosive than the flu. So this R factor, which is how many people does it spread to, dramatically higher than the flu. And so it gets out of control really quickly. But the inpatient mortality is, somewhere around 8%, over 8%. So probably 8.5, 8 2/3%. So it's pushing 4 times as deadly as the flu once you're admitted. So this whole notion of, hey, not many people are dying and it's not that deadly is frankly incorrect. This is a very serious virus. And so that's one arm, is that it's very serious when people get sick enough to be hospitalized, that a lot of people do unfortunately die. But the other end of the spectrum is it explodes very quickly. So that, that 750 beds we used happened over the course from 100 up to 750 in the course of about 2 weeks that we went up that climb, versus the worst flu season we'd seen in years where we were at 190 patients, almost none of whom needed ICU. Now we need, in this phase, probably 15-20% of people needing ICU. So that's, we got to 180, 190 people in an ICU bed. So it's a very, very different virus than the flu, and minimizing it is really, the wrong answer. So when you look at what the numbers are, we have to get control of the virus. There's been this temptation, and understandably, and it's a logical thing to look at, which is hospitalizations and ICU beds. But those are lagging indicators, and those are the outcome of the decisions and the things we do together as a community. And yes, we need to keep the curve flat, and we need get things out of control at the hospitals. That has to happen. But boy, we came pretty darn close this last time to getting completely out of control in Houston. I mean, when we get to the numbers I'm talking about, your margin of safety or margin of error is almost gone at that point. Thankfully, we're starting to come back down, but we're still 5 times what we were in May. So if things were to go back up tomorrow, there's like no margin of safety if we had that kind of expansion compared to the last time. So what we really all together need to do is get the virus levels back down. Right now we have somewhere on the order of 2,000 cases being diagnosed across the greater Houston area. Obviously there's noise in the data because there's more testing than there was before. We get into all that. But we look at that, we look at testing positivity rates, and there are far more people in the community right now that have the virus than had the virus in May. So we have to get that number down dramatically. We're working at the Med Center to put up a dashboard. I looked at it today with the team of CEOs. We looked at it with the county and city officials, really trying to say, look, what's our goal to get the virus in control? Because ultimately, our goal has to be control the virus, protect the economy, and get our kids back to school, educate our children. Those have to be ands, not ors. So they all have to be things we face on. The problem is the second and third are really hard to do if we let the virus get out of control. So we need to get virus levels back down similar to what we saw in May. So we did this after the first surge, and we got the virus levels down to less than 200. I think we got even below 150 some days across greater Houston. So we're still off by, a factor of 9 or 10, which is pretty dramatic. To get there is going to require that we continue to do the things we're doing, from social distancing, from mask wearing, the things that have clearly bent the curve right now, that have clearly resulted in hospitalizations coming down. But we've got a lot more shared sacrifice that has to happen around social lives, social gatherings, and other places where we're seeing outbreaks to get those numbers down. Because the reality, this is just the cold, hard reality that we're dealing with, is if we start with a virus level of 2,000 and then advance things in the economy or in society, let's say it that way, quickly, whether that is schools, whether that is advancing more businesses opening, whether that's our religious institutions, we're going to get out of control pretty quickly when we put more people interacting with more people. And the margin of error right now is next to nothing compared to where we were in May when that happened. And so we've got to get back down to those kinds of levels. So we're looking at trying to get back down in that 200-ish range, something like that in cases, a case positivity rate that could come down probably in the 5% range or so. Put that in perspective, New York City is at 1% right now. So they did it even in a place like New York City. Now, it took pretty draconian measures, obviously, to get there. But even with the explosion of cases and deaths and everything else they had, they got that down. We peaked as a community probably in the 25 to 27% range, which means with all those tests being done, we were seeing, 25 to 27, 28% of those be positive. I had some peak days across Houston Methodist in the mid 30s where we were doing, the peak number of diagnoses we did just at Methodist alone was 550 on a single day. That's 2.5 times what we've got to get to as a community. Now, thankfully, we're in the 150 range now at Houston Methodist, so things have definitely come down. We're seeing more community-wide still, but the numbers are coming down. We're back down in the 15, 16% range as a community. So we've already made significant progress. I think we can get there. And the fundamental thing I'd like to see people following, and we're debating this with the city and county a little bit, but there's something called the R. We've been talking about that since the beginning. You hear R naught or you hear RT. RT is just the R at a specific point in time. But just think of it real simply as the spreadability. If I get the virus, how many people do I give the virus to? If R is 1, that means I give it to 1. Well, if it's 1, we're going to constantly kind of, have a chain of virus, probably relatively steady state, but it's going to be a chain where it doesn't ever go down, and we're always kind of at risk of going back up. The R, sort of at baseline for this virus is probably 3+. So on average, probably I would, if we were doing nothing in the community, I would give people the virus, 3 people the virus each time, which means it explodes rapidly. That's the exponential spread we talked about. And then you see what's the observed R at any given time based on all the things we do as a community. And, when things got out of hand in June, we had an R probably in the 1.5 to 2 range. So it does, if we had a 3, we'd have really been in trouble. So we still had lots of things happening in the community, but every person was giving it to 1.5, 2 people. And look how things exploded out of control. Right now, the R is bubbling around 1. Today, when I looked for yesterday, it was slightly above 1. A couple of days ago, it was slightly below 1. Ideally, we really would work together, make all the sacrifices we do to push the R down to 0.7, 0.8, and do that for a couple months and truly get this virus leveled down. Because I think otherwise, we're going to just kind of go from surge back to valley, back to surge, back to valley, and no one wants to be there. I mean, that's what you're describing. We've all had it with this virus, right? But the virus hadn't had it with us, and it's going to keep pushing. So, unfortunately. So,
Matt, you got a question?
Part of I've heard a couple of different things. That one, that the health kind of long-term health effects of this virus are different than what I heard at the very beginning. It's like the flu; you slough it off. Is there any data that suggests what the long-term health effects are of
yes.
this?
Yeah, and that's another place. This is no question different than the flu for many people. Now, look, there's a third of people are asymptomatic, particularly the younger you go on the age spectrum, and they barely knew they had the virus. That's good news. Science doesn't completely understand why we have that individual, and then we've got somebody, on ECMO right now, which is artificial lungs. We've got about 10 people on ECMO just at Houston Methodist right now. Many of whom will not survive that because that's kind of a Hail Mary pass kind of treatment for those individuals. And we see that vast spectrum, and science doesn't fully understand that, to be quite honest. And that's, obviously frustrating to everybody, first and foremost, the clinicians and people caring for people, but of course for our community as well as we learn about this virus. But what we're seeing is some long-term sequelae. So there's been a lot of concerning studies out there. Obviously, people really severely ill are not getting better as rapidly. So some of them are going to have long-term lung issues, long-term heart issues, et cetera. But we're seeing increasing number of studies. For instance, one that was done pretty recently looked at about 100 patients or so and looked at MRI of their heart. So they did a cardiac MRI. Something like 6 weeks, I don't recall exactly, but let's call it about 6 weeks after they were diagnosed. About 2/3 of those individuals were recovered at home. So they were sick, but they weren't sick enough to need hospitalization. About 1/3 of them had hospitalization. The number was somewhere around 2/3 to 3/4 of them showed cardiac involvement by the virus at 6 weeks out. Wow. Now how many of those will evolve into heart failure, how many of those evolve into rhythm disturbances and some other things is still unknown. On an autopsy series of about 35 or 40 patients, then these are patients who passed away, of course, the vast majority of them had cardiac involvement, for instance. We're seeing neurological symptoms, lots of clotting symptoms that are happening, many, many other things that are evolving. And so, we're actively working with some of our outcomes team to basically talk about what's going to be our ongoing COVID clinics that are going to care for patients who may not have recovered very well or who may have long-term sequelae. So, if you ask me, do you want this virus? You really don't. You may get lucky. You may be one of the people who have minimal symptoms. You could be unlucky and be in the hospital and be incredibly ill. You could be, somebody who unfortunately has, long-term sequelae of this. So the fewer people we can make sure get the virus until we get to a point of treatments, and I'm happy to talk about treatments and particularly vaccines that I do think are a promise for, in the visible future now, something like December, January is not out of the question when we look at that.
Okay. Well, that's a great segue too. I know there's a lot of talk in news and stuff about, I don't know the different terms, like therapeutics or whether they're drugs that help people once they have COVID. We've talked about some of those, and some we learn, over time. I remember when we talked back in March or April or whenever it was, we thought certain things about certain things, and it always amazes me that some people, politically go, look, they were wrong when they said it's like, we're always learning. About this. But what is the update on vaccines? That's the big, we're looking forward to the V-Day, Victory Day.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think another follow-up, so the vaccine update, but also one of the things that I'm hearing now is like, just because a vaccine is done and they ship it, that doesn't mean this thing is over the next day, I guess. And
Correct.
what does that look like?
No, that's a great point. In fact, I read something from an epidemiologist who I admire and respect recently. One of the things he wrote, he says, we got to stop thinking of vaccines as this on-off switch. It's not going to be on-off switch. It's going to be a rheostat or a dimmer, right? Because, to vaccinate, billions of people across the world is quickly is really unprecedented. Now, the government, federal government, put together Operation Warp Speed, and this is one of the really good decisions I think that has been made, and it's basically a fast track process to where they're picking the most likely winners, and they are they're putting the money in to manufacture vaccines basically as the vaccines are being tested, which of course means there may be some vaccines where we spend a boatload of money and then basically toss them all in the trash. But if you want to actually get this out more quickly, it's really the only way to go. And so I think that makes tons of sense and, is very positive. The good news is there's several, probably 3 or 4 vaccine candidates that look pretty promising when you look at the trials. There's 3 or 4 in phase 3 trials now. So, phase 1 trials, a few people, and you look at safety. Phase 2 is now where you're looking at broader numbers for safety, but you're really starting to look at efficacy. It's not that you don't look at efficacy in phase 1, but that's not the principal purpose. The principal purpose is to make sure you're not, giving people something with any drug that is going to have harmful effects. And then as you start entering phase 3, you start talking like Moderna, I think is at the phase 3 point of around 30,000 people to get the vaccine, but they have to get a vaccine. They have to get another vaccine booster in a month, and then they need a couple months of data. And they have to frankly have in the 2 arms, it's a randomized controlled trial. So you don't know if you get it or not. They have to have, enough people get the virus. So you have to find places to do this where the virus is around, enough people to get the virus, frankly, in the, control arm to actually know if there's a difference or not, right? If you gave it to a bunch of people and no one gets COVID in either arm, you can't prove anything. So they're saying probably November to December, they're going to have an answer. But they're ready to go as an example. And I think it's the same thing with the Oxford vaccine with AstraZeneca, perhaps a couple of the others that are out there. They're all saying we're ready to go pretty rapidly. After that, they would hope if it shows what we hope it will show, they would get an emergency use authorization, and you would start to see probably high-risk individuals, probably frontline fire, police, hospital workers, physicians, nurses, et cetera, getting vaccines, and then vulnerable people in the population would be how that's going to be prioritized. But that's TBD. They've not said exactly how that will be allocated or determined. So I'm hopeful that the beginning of that rheostat can happen perhaps as early as December, more likely probably January, February, and none of that's 100%, right? We may get a vaccine trial and be wildly disappointed, but all of the original data we're seeing is very encouraging. There's a lot of chatter in the press about waning antibody levels and those kinds of things, but they miss a lot of the point, because the way the body's immune system works is you develop these antibodies, they will wane over time, but your body has all sorts of essential, think of it simply as sort of memory in its immune system, so that when it gets challenged with an antigen, which is what it's seeing, the foreign object it's seeing, it can mount up an antibody response pretty well. And the data looks pretty good in humans in terms of the antibody response that's been there. They've shown in macaque monkeys that they can give a couple of the different vaccines and then challenge the monkeys with virus, and they don't get the virus. So we're seeing a lot of positive signals. So I'm, crossing my fingers. Don't want to overcall it or overpromise. Certainly, I don't have anything to do with those trials right now. But at least what we're seeing is pretty encouraging.
So have you heard, or do you know, or can you speak to, is this something that you take one time and then you're immune forever, or would you have to have it every couple of years, or is it like a flu shot that you have to have every year?
Yeah, that's still evolving and uncertain. It's still not clear yet, depending on the different vaccines, whether it's one shot or one shot plus a booster. Of course, most vaccines, if you have one shot plus a booster, you already start having some immunity, with the first one, but the booster kind of puts you over the top, so to speak. What we don't know is how long that immunity will last. I think we have every reason to believe it will last for a reasonable amount of time. reasonable being, operative of a year or 2 or 3, somewhere in that range. It could be longer. I don't think we're seeing anything from what I understand. Again, I'm getting out of my expertise realm, but from what I'm reading, what I'm understanding as we talk to individuals, I listen to some of the experts. I don't think they believe that it's going to wane in just a matter of months, because that obviously would be very problematic. But I think it's quite possible we're looking at either a flu shot scenario or every couple 3-year booster shot phenomenon. It's not unheard of course. Tetanus shot, for instance, is every 10 years. If you end up with a dirty injury, it's every 5. You have to get a booster within 5 years. So it's not unheard of to do that. Flu shot, of course, we do every year because the flu virus is constantly mutating and we deal with different strains. So again, unknown, but hopeful. But again, to expect that that's going to somehow solve this, it's not going to do that. But it will make a difference if we can vaccinate 5% of the population, then 10%, then 15%. Obviously, we decrease the vulnerability in the population and ramp back down the number. So the hope is that, through the first half of 2021, maybe into around this time, 2021, you could get to a critical mass of people being vaccinated. But that's a big hope. And there's a big question mark in there too, is the public's acceptance of it. If you do surveys right now, you get about 50% of people say they will get the vaccine. And then the rest is split between, well, I'll wait and see. And, heck no, I'm not going to get the vaccine. And we need 60%, estimated, nobody knows that for sure, they've not done this before, but estimated at least 60% herd immunity, meaning either getting the virus and having immunity to it or getting vaccinated for that in order to get this thing, pushed down. And that's the other key message. I think the operative word there is going to be pushed down. I don't think the operative word is going to be this is suddenly going to vanish next year if we get a bunch of people vaccinated, even with some herd immunity. Obviously, if we could get 100% vaccinated, we might get there. But the reality, we're probably going to be living with this. Now, living with this where most of the population has been vaccinated and is immune and isn't going to have to worry about it as much. So it'll be much less disruptive. But I predict our hospitals, our doctors, our nurses are going to be caring for people with COVID, for many, many years, just like they do with the flu.
Wow. How's your staff doing? I know another issue is staffing. Hospitals are typically not staffed to be 100% full, or ERs, those sorts of things. How is that working with hospitals in our area?
Yeah, they're hanging in there. It's been a tough time, as you can imagine, for frontline hospital workers. It's been a long run here. This past 7-8 weeks has been extraordinarily challenging. If you talked to them a few weeks ago, it was tough. They're working hard, seeing mass new numbers of people come in every day, no end in sight, right? It's always worse when you're kind of seeing it and you just don't see the light at the end of the tunnel, and they weren't seeing it. And frankly, they'd go out in the community, and after spending their day here, seeing those dynamics and, seeing very ill people, handling and helping people who are struggling to breathe, dealing with families with loss of loved ones, et cetera. And they go out and not exactly see the kinds of things we need to do in the community. That was tough for hospital employees, for nurses, for physicians. Thankfully, with us back down, now the light at the end of the tunnel, or at least, you start seeing it. Whether we're going to actually achieve kind of an end, I don't think is realistic, but at least now, it's sort of like the balloon's deflating and things are a little better. We've really been pushing now to say, hey, we've got to figure out how this next month or two, we get some people some rest and some time off because, they need to recharge their batteries. Frankly, we are preparing as if there will be, yet another surge. I think, unfortunately, we've seen the sort of pandemic scenario play out to where I think we have pretty decent clarity around what it looks like. And there was a lot of dialogue about, was it one big surge and then it just bubble along for a long time and go away eventually, or did it act like a flu pandemic and you get, a spring surge and then a huge fall surge after it kind of dies down in the summer. Neither one of those clearly have happened at this point. I think it's kind of the third scenario that was being discussed, which is really peaks and valleys and peaks and valleys. So, we've seen a first peak that, frankly turned out to be a foothill of the mountain. And then we saw a big, huge mountain next. And we're coming down that, the slope is much slower going down than it was going up. And we don't yet know where the valley will be. The question is going to be really, how do we control those subsequent peaks? If we go back to how we acted at the end of May, we're just going to have worse peaks. And frankly, if we start from a higher level, they're going to be much, much worse. And so we need to focus on how we all come together with unity and make sure we drive these virus levels down, so that when it does start to creep back up, we all then jump in and react, right? Ultimately, around, the latter part of June into right at the beginning of July, people changed their behaviors, and some of that was mandated because of masks and things, but a lot of it was just people saying, oh, shoot, things are out of control here. I've got to act differently. But we got to keep that going if we want to get this thing in control. And it's really, inconvenient, and it's really frustrating. And it just is a unfortunate reality that we have to focus on, because we cannot allow those peaks to keep coming and keep getting bigger, or we'll see people dying, and we'll see, hospitals at some point overwhelmed. Because if we start from 300 or 400 and start that next surge and peak, you're not going to be at 750 at Methodist. You're going to be at 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, 1,300. That looks a lot different. That's extraordinarily challenging for the staff, for the hospital, and frankly, there's a lot of negative effects on the community. Obviously, as it basically pushes out other care. That you just simply across the country can't expand rapidly like that at every institution. It's just not possible.
Have your frontline workers seen many with diagnosed positive cases?
Well, the good news, so we actually just published a study. It's online. You can look at it. Got accepted by one of the journals that was looking early on when we started doing surveillance testing back in April, as we were still learning about this virus. And what we saw was we had some little hot spots on kind of frontline areas with 4 or 5% positivity in asymptomatic people. But in kind of other patient-facing areas, less than 1%, and in non-patient facing areas, 0%, which implied to us, hey, we need to do better education, better communication, better work around some of the protective activities. And since then, we've done surveillance and actually keep it very, very low. So the good news is we don't see, any significant number of patient to employee or patient to caregiver kinds of communication. The challenge we face, like every business does, is occasionally we'll see employee to employee transmission. People get in the break, people come in, they don't realize they have it. They let their guard down in a break room or someplace like that when they're not wearing protection, and can give it to each other, thankfully in small numbers. But we have 26,000 employees, so we're seeing our employees live in the community just like everybody else, and we're seeing some employees get that, and of course we have to care for them and keep them out of work. But by and large, we've been able to do that very, very effectively. And we have a very educated workforce. There's actually a couple of very interesting studies. Mass General Brigham, which is what they changed their name, but it's what they changed the name of the overall organization, which is a conglomeration of a whole bunch of hospitals in the kind of Boston area. But the two anchors are the Mass General and Brigham and Women's Hospital. They did a study looking at some of the transmission they had in-house, and you could see it go up, and then they put a masking order in for their staff, and it started to level off. And then they put a masking in for all visitors and especially for all patients, and they saw it come down. Wow. And so it's why you see so many graphics everywhere around, both people should be wearing a mask. I mean, there's a whole series of ones we use, which is, not okay, if neither has it, a little better if one has it, a little better if the other, or about the same if the other has it. This is the way you do it is, with both people wearing a mask. So we see even in very high prevalence situations, when you do the masking, it works. There's no question the data suggests it works. And, when I talk about frustrating things in society, there's nothing more frustrating to a group of physicians and healthcare workers than the whole debate about masks, which, frankly, got off on the wrong foot back, in February, March, as the CDC and others said, oh, hold off, don't do this. But as the science emerged and it became really clear that it worked, unfortunately, it became a politicized message. And, some of the very same people who were, in the kind of damn the torpedoes, let's open things up phase, were also the people sitting there saying, but don't wear a mask while you do it. And those are kind of intellectually, at odds with each other. The right answer, like with everything, the right answer is wear a mask, and the right answer is not damn the torpedoes, and the right answer is not shut everything down. The right answer is let's do things together and thoughtfully. And, that's what we've been really trying to do. Let's do it data-driven, and let's do it very thoughtful.
Well, I think that's a really good word for people, is thinking about from you saying, here are the key things that we need to do to let's keep it in check best we can, and that's wearing a mask, And that's when you're not able to social distance, right? And pretty much when you're indoors. I know businesses now mandate masks, but when you're outside and you're able to social distance, you're okay is pretty much the case.
Yeah,
is that correct?
There are some places starting to do more, but I mean, my feeling in general, if you're outdoors, and let's be clear, if you're outdoors walking, exercising, jogging, those kinds of things, walking around the neighborhood with family, I don't think a mask is certainly necessary in those times. If you're talking about an outdoor setting where you're sitting with other people, socializing, I mean, we need to minimize big groups, but if you're talking about a small group of people, you need to be pretty well distanced if you're not going to be wearing a mask. Even outdoors, if you're going to be close by, just wear the mask. Indoors, if you're going to be with other individuals now outside of your kind of home family unit, I really recommend that you have a mask on when you're interacting with those individuals. I mean, what we are seeing is the most common story of where we see lots of people getting ill. It's when they let their guard down. It is social gatherings, it's family functions, it's all of those kinds of things. But, obviously bars we heard all about, but bars are closed down now. Those are the challenging times, and it's human behavior. So, for example, you take four groupings of a family together who live all over Houston, and you bring them to somebody's house for a birthday party. And, you celebrate the birthday. Well, every one of those groups of people, unless they've been 100%, isolated at home, which this day and age almost nobody is, they've each got their own sort of array of people that they are communicating with or interacting with. And so you've now magnified that dramatically. And those family units come in and they sit there and they sit around the dinner table and the masks are off and they celebrate and they get too close and, they share plates and utensils and bathrooms and all the things that happen, right? And you see, I mean, most of them do fine. And every so often, one of those families has a big outbreak and we'll see 6, 7, 8 members of a family. I've got way too many stories of husband and wife in an ICU. I've got, one story where we have the wife has already passed away and the husband is so desperately ill in ICU. I'm worried, and they're teenage children at home. Those are really tragic stories. And you look back to how those things happen in many of those cases. And it is letting one's guard down.
Well, so as I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to break this podcast really up into two. There's so much good information here. And so we've been talking about where we are on the virus and what's going on and the things that we can do. The second half that we're going to share next week really is all about regathering of worship and a lot about schools and how we get back and get our kids to school and why it's a priority and what we can do to get there. So I'm glad to have Joseph with us both weeks on all of that, and it'll be exciting. So join us to continue the second half of the conversation. I'm John Stevens.
And I'm Joseph Clam.
Hey, and this is Pod Have Mercy.
I don't have a microphone in front of me.